Welcome to In Good Faith. This is totally out of the ordinary. Today we're on the bridge of the SS IGF, that's for In Good Faith, with a wonderful crew we've assembled, and we've sort of got an all-star cast from other crews of various podcasts. And it came up in conversation about spirituality and Star Trek, because there actually are, as you will hear, some very interesting insights. We have not had a pre-discussion about who loves what and who is moved by what or has an insight about what. So there is lots to discover. So let's go around and have quick introductions.
Yes, so Robert Monson, and I am a PhD student in religious studies, but I host two podcasts. One, Black Coffee and Theology, with Rose J. Percy as my co-host, and then Three Black Men podcast with Sam and Trey. My favorite Star Trek show is Star Trek Discovery. It used to be Voyager, but Discovery's done it.
I'm Dani Lee. I am the priest in charge at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Provo. And my favorite series is the original series.
Dan Libenson. I'm the co-host of the Judaism Unbound podcast. I would say probably it's a toss-up between the original series and the Next Generation, but for sort of sentimental reasons, it's the Next Generation because my family moved out of the country when I was 14, and the way that I kind of kept connected was people would send me VHS tapes of this
so
new show that was like,
cute.
so it really brings back those memories.
I'm Carl Youngblood. I'm the president of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, and we're still pre-launch on a couple of podcasts, one called Pioneers, but one that maybe is more relevant to this discussion is called Worlds Without End. And although I don't consider myself a Trekkie, I've certainly seen my fair share of Trek shows, and I'd say probably the one that's most near and dear is the Next Generation. That's the one I grew up with. Those are the ones I remember best. But really looking forward to this, guys.
And I'm Barry Lam. I am the host and producer of Hi-Phi Nation, a philosophy podcast at Slate. I'm also a philosophy professor at UC Riverside. And I will say unambiguously that my favorite series is The Next Generation. I feel like I was raised by The Next Generation. I feel like a lot of my values come from The Next Generation. I know that series by heart. I can probably recite lines. I've also enjoyed other series like DS9 and Discovery. So I'm happy to talk about any of them.
Great. I have to say, I was around when the original was premiering for
Like
the first
live
time.
shooting.
TV.
Yeah, like
in black
like
and
you
white.
and Kirk are like this.
Yeah, in black and white.
You were a
Almost.
baby, though.
Yeah.
I was pretty young.
Okay.
But I have images. Yeah, but it's become DS9 since then for various reasons. And we're going to we'll talk about some of those. But I started on Discovery. I'm late to the game on that. But it's pretty interesting to see where they've gone. Okay, so Gene Roddenberry, September 8th, 1969 was the premiere. And he had this vision. He said, a lot of science fiction is nihilistic and dark and dreadful about the future, and Star Trek is an opposite. And then Leonard Nimoy, commenting on that, says, we need that kind of hope, that kind of confidence in the future. I think that's what Star Trek offers. I have to believe that. I'm the glass half full kind of guy. So, Barry, you talked about adopting values and things that you saw. Talk to me about that.
Well, one of the things I think is, I think of Star Trek as kind of the idealistic enactment of the Enlightenment, right? So the idea that science makes progress, the idea that like the kind of progress that you make culminates in a kind of humanity that pursues knowledge for knowledge's sake, right? That material needs have been met and that the thing that's left is to improve humanity. That's like a very Enlightenment kind of value. And later series finally start to kind of question that and make it problematic and what happens when the material realities are very different, right? And that's what makes the development of Star Trek interesting over the course of time, because initially it's about encountering the new and how that rubs up against certain kinds of Enlightenment values. For instance, the Prime Directive plays this big role in the Next Generation, whether you have interference in cultures, and then there are times where it's violated, and we're always meant as an audience to think through the moral issues, but then come out on the side of, well, they made the right decision in this kind of case. This is the kind of decision that some Enlightenment philosopher like Kant or Hume would have. And then, things develop over the course of the last 20 years with different series that like raises questions about the original. So that's the thing that I think of is of value.
You definitely see the times being echoed in each series,
That's
right?
right.
Where it's like the concerns of the time, the lack of awareness of certain things is definitely apparent there. Yeah.
Right.
So as a philosophy professor, do you ever have like students trying to make a point, and do they ever refer to Star Trek?
No, because they're too young.
Oh,
right?
okay.
They'll watch it if their parents made them watch it.
Okay.
But that's very rare. And my teaching career has run about 15, 16 years now, and so it's less and less.
Yeah.
I think it's fewer and fewer students are interested in that aspect of sci-fi. Other aspects of sci-fi are more prominent in their vocabulary, in their cultural vocabularies. I really think of Star Trek as a Gen X and older kind of phenomena.
Yes.
So, Reverend Dani, how do you see spirituality showing up in different places?
Well, in the original series especially, you see a lot of quasi-religious ritual coming from the Vulcans, right?
Yeah.
And Leonard Nimoy speaks about it in his books, about how he got inspiration from Jewish ritual and he created like this culture, of Vulcans. And they have like a lot of hand gestures and a lot of movements that signify something, right? So there's a lot of ritual imbued in that culture. So you look at it and you see how they are a people that are extremely advanced scientifically, but they are tethered by all these rituals and gestures that bring some meaning to their life and creates like this unifying things, because it's a whole planet of people that are diverse, right? And they also have that philosophical concept that is at the basis of Vulcan culture, and is infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And that, that speaks about that radical acceptance, but, in a way that is unifying to all. And that speaks to me so much because I'm Episcopalian, right? We're part of the Anglican communion. We are all so different worldwide. Mm-hmm. And yet we have our Book of Common Prayer, and we have like all these shared rituals in our almost infinite combinations, maybe, right? So that spoke to me so deeply when I started watching the original series. And it was really life-giving to me to see that possibility in how we're trying to enact it in our imperfect world and how it is idealized in the show.
So I remember as a teenager, I'm reading the New Testament, and I come across the part that says, in the next life, we will know as we are known, a perfect knowledge and love for each other. And I'm just picturing the Vulcan mind meld. And
yes.
I thought, you would have to be so vulnerable. Like, we need to share this information, but you're also going to learn a whole bunch about me. And I thought, what would I not want someone to know in a Vulcan mind meld? And how humble would I have to be? Like, well, here I am, all of me. That was actually, I felt like this strange spiritual insight. Robert, do you have a favorite episode or a character or somebody that spoke to you or that you feel like you got some insight from?
Yeah, I've had so many characters that I enjoy, but I would have to say the one that has impacted my scholarship and my thought process now is Michael Burnham and in Star Trek Discovery. Going back to something that our brother said a moment ago is, Star Trek is labeled as this enlightened, what happens when we're in the future and we've done away with all of humanity's issues and we're just one big happy family. But we find in each of the series, it actually reinscribes a lot of problematic things, right? Most of the captains were men. Most of them were white men. And so later, when they are trying to inject elements of diversity, there's all this pushback. And I have many thoughts on that. But what I love about the life of Michael Burnham over the series of Star Trek Discovery is we see a Black woman in process healing herself. She was raised by Vulcans after a terrible tragedy, which I've had many tragedies in my life. And so we see as she evolves, as she comes into her own humanness, her own power, she sets everyone around her free. And everyone flourishes because she is herself. And so much to the point where she saves the future, all of the universe, just at the beauty of a Black woman coming into her own. We see every character tethered to her flourish because of her vulnerability and her power. And so that is such a beautiful picture of the life that I'm trying to live, that I want people tethered to me to know themselves and to be known in such a way. Yeah.
Dan, when you were watching those VHS tapes that were being sent to you, I mean, was it at first it was like, this is cool, this is sci-fi, or was there something else when did you connect to it a deeper sort of way?
Well, I think I connected to the original series in my childhood. It was the reruns. I'm a little younger than you. But like Reverend Dani was saying, like I think that this way that Leonard Nimoy took a lot of the Vulcan practices from Judaism made, I think, Star Trek feel very Jewish and very exciting for Jews. And actually, it's weird that the first time that, there's the Vulcan hand gesture,
Yes.
with the spread fingers. And that's actually a Jewish hand gesture from the blessing of the priests. And it was weird that the first time I saw that in a Jewish context, I was like, why are they doing the Vulcan hand gestures, right? And
That's
but I mean there was this on this
Life
deep
imitates
sense.
art.
Yeah,
right?
but on this deep sense, you felt like, wow, this is really connected to me. And I mean, I was a teenager, so it was less kind of philosophical and spiritual and more just a sense of connection. I mean, it's interesting, Robert, like comparing it to what you're saying about Michael Burnham. There's something about feeling represented, feeling like your culture is helping make the world a better place in some way that I think is powerful on a subconscious level.
Yeah, and Lieutenant Uhura was really groundbreaking in the original one. Nichelle Nichols. Boy, she got a lot of
touched me.
pushback.
Yeah, she
but
did.
she stayed the course, and she changed a lot of things. I mean, obviously the casting director, Gene Roddenberry, and everything.
Can I say something to that is what that did for so many Black people was it freed us to know that in the future, Black people are there. And that sounds like such a basic thing that, well, of course. Well, no, seeing this powerful woman on this bridge have so many complex thoughts. Wow, in the future, in this radical imagination, Black people are there. That is a radical thought. And it was at the time, and it continues to be, yeah.
Interesting.
What's so interesting about that as I reflect on it is that there's no, as far as I can remember, there's no official Jews in Star Trek. But clearly the Vulcans are Jews. You know?
Yeah. You're like, kind of, but they are.
And so they're not there, and yet they are. It's weird.
That's really interesting. I'm wondering if we could go around. You may or may not have a favorite moment that spoke to you. And I'll tell you one of mine. So it's, I was going to look up the exact name, but it's the Picard and his flute episode.
Yeah, Inner Light.
The Inner Light.
Inner Light. Oh, okay. Good.
This is a Star Trek scholar. He knows.
No, people cite
It's a
the Inner
classic
Light
one, though,
as a classic episode.
Well,
that
I
speaks to a
should
lot of-
yield to these gentlemen who knew the name.
Do you want to summarize it for your listeners?
So they're traveling through space. They're exploring. There is some sort of beacon or satellite they come across, and somehow it connects with Picard, and he's unconscious, but his mind is racing. They're trying to figure out, do we destroy it, but will that hurt him? And meanwhile, he's living an entire lifetime that includes raising a family and being on a planet that, unknown to many of the inhabitants, is doomed. One of the important things is he learns to play this traditional flute of this society and plays it when he's thinking. And finally, at the end, he witnesses the end of this civilization that you have come to love and relate to. And then the signal stops. He comes back to himself. And when they finally retrieve the satellite, inside is that flute. And not only then, but in subsequent episodes, occasionally he's seen pondering and playing that. And the idea that he was given the gift of a lifetime of understanding of another person or another culture, I was just stunned by.
Yeah.
You guys who know the name of it,
Well, so to fill in some of the details, the planet was essentially dying of global climate change. If you remember this, it was a drought, and ground wasn't fertile anymore, and he was an early discoverer of this as a scientist. So he, in this lifetime, remembers being on the Enterprise, believes that he's stranded from the Enterprise and is unable to get off. So he has all of these memories and scientific interests that he had as a scientist, but then gets to live out a life that he very saliently in the series wanted but never got, which is to live with a family and raise children and have grandchildren. It's something that he is always depicted as being stone cold against, but deep down, it was the one thing that was missing from Picard's life that he ended up experiencing, right, within the planet. So much so that he has the kind of lifestyle that is the alternative to the Picard lifestyle. There's like this mirror image. Family, community, right, tying to the land, a kind of fulfillment in this life that he mourns for at the end. And the surprise for him is that he wakes up and he asks, how long have I been out for? After having lived essentially whatever it was, 50 years of a life there. They said 25 minutes, something like that. And he has to be reacquainted with who he is as Jean-Luc Picard. And he doesn't even tell. He writes a report, essentially, but he doesn't tell everybody just how rich that life was until a later episode we discover when he has like a love interest that he finally says, I had a family. And so it was so special to him that he couldn't even report it, as just another feature of an alien encounter.
It was left out of the Stardate the log, right?
That's right.
Carl, favorite episode or moment, character?
Well, I would say, I don't have the names of the episodes memorized. I think
okay.
one of the
it's
most,
safe.
We'll tell you.
Most
Yes.
marking episodes is for me got to be the one with the Borg, right? Where they encounter the Borg.
Of course. Yeah.
There's so many interesting implications of this episode that I think as I ponder it more, maybe I didn't fully consider this when I first saw it, but what we're struck by is just the sameness of these creatures and their like utter lack of emotion and but their power partly because they are so united. And then there's this fear of like, could they beat us? This idea that is that system somehow better than humanity? And that's the threat of the episode that's presented, right?
That's beautiful.
And as I consider this and the spiritual implications of this, I'm thinking about the importance or the fundamental feeling we have that there's this important aspect to agency, to human, the ability to engage in something voluntarily, not be forced to do it, and that we need somehow to achieve unity amidst that freedom, right? And I think that's the big challenge. Another huge thing that ties into all this is the notion of like centralization versus decentralization, right? Me personally, as a Latter-day Saint, I think one of the things I think is quite empowering about our theology is that we believe that ultimately, as children of God, we have this capacity to become like God, and that essentially God is creating other gods, right? And I think of that as like the most extreme form of decentralization possible, right? Full empowerment of creatures that are like spreading throughout the universe. And so in that sense, I kind of think of Star Trek as almost depicting that kind of future. But the Borg is like a direct threat to that notion, right? So
Was anyone else kind of, even though she's a really awesome character, the Borg queen, quote unquote, was anyone disappointed that, there's just one person in charge instead? Like it wasn't the whole collective. Like somebody's...
Actually, it made sense to me.
Did it?
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, is the queen in an anthill in charge of the ant colony? I would argue maybe not, because like she's also serving a function, but without all that innate programming and all the other Borgs, or like
Without a queen, the contrast is between a bunch of individuals who value their individuality, and what comes out of that is conflict, right, and different goals, and then like the beauty of life is just try to like work together on it. Whereas the Borg is like they're just individual cells in one organism. Well, the Queen made it more like a bee model, like so. The idea being that there are individual bees, but they don't have goals on themselves. The goal is the colony, and the goal is the reproduction of the queen, as opposed to individuals. So it's a slight change from no queen, but it's still the idea. The big contrast is between individuality, human individuality, and the conflicts that arise from that, which we think of as a good, right? And the Borg think of as like that's the thing we're trying to control. Like we have none of that.
Yeah.
Dan, any particular episode?
Yeah,
Character?
but I also just want to remark on this one that, for me, there really is this thing that I think about a lot spiritually about whether we are or should think of ourselves as cells in an organism, meaning that we're part of a oneness versus individuality, and it's both.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether there's Star Trek episodes that, I'm not thinking of one right now that really explores that bothness of it. For me, the one that sticks is Darmok, which is from season 5 of The Next Generation. And it's essentially the story where the crew of the Enterprise encounters this alien race, and they can understand the words that they're saying, but they can't understand the meaning of what they're saying because they seem to be describing stories. And famously, they say Darmak en Jalad et Tanagra, and they don't know what that means. And it turns out that it's a story from this culture about two enemies who kind of met and had to fight a common enemy together, and that bonded them. And instead of saying that, they say Darmak en Jalad et Tanagra.
It's like Gilgamesh.
It's like Gilgamesh. But that for me is this deep idea that I think that's what our religious stories do, right? That when I'm in a leadership situation and the people I'm leading are annoying me, then I can think, Moses at the when he hit the rock, right? And I think that we have these powerful stories that we can tap into, and they're really powerful for those of us on the inside who know the stories, but they're totally mysterious to people on the outside. And I think often those of us who are on the inside don't realize how impenetrable these stories are to people on the outside, and we think we're just talking.
That's a good point.
So that episode for me is just really powerful as a reminder.
And when you were watching it, weren't you engaged mentally in trying to? I was trying to figure this out. Like, I've got to solve this for these people. There's a way out of this. It was very engaging.
But it was only years later that I started to make the connections to our own, what we're doing in our own religions.
Dani, favorite character episode?
Yeah, so it's not my favorite one that I rewatch often, but I think it's the one that had the greatest impact on me, and it's called In the Pale Moonlight from DS9. And in it, and I don't remember all the details of it, but I think Sisko and one of the Cardassians, I think, plot together to either frame or kill a Romulan so that the Romulans join in the war against the Dominion. Right, so it's a very controversial episode because you see Sisko engaging in something that is definitely bad.
Yes.
Right, but the outcome of that one awful action will have positive results on basically the whole quadrant. Right, so he is probably saving millions of lives by conspiring to kill one. So it's this very murky ethic, from an ethical standpoint, because you want to be like a good Kantian boy and say, oh, this was bad, so it's always bad. But then you kind of look at it and say, okay, but there's nuance to this, right? And he has this speech at the end of the episode saying, if I have to bear the guilt for this, knowing that something positive came out of it, that I am happy to bear that guilt. So he's not even seeking absolution. He will carry that guilt of that death or that betrayal, knowing that something good came out of it, but it will not give him absolution. So that really...
Oh, you're preaching. Yes.
It's a professional hazard.
Hey, I'm like, hey, pass a collection plate. Hey.
So that was very fascinating to me, and it's something that kind of stays with me, not because, I'm all of a sudden, feeling like, oh, we should all be engaging in morally weird things, but because sometimes part of life is sitting with some sort of burden that will make life better for other people. So it's a very humane episode.
And a choice you can't remake.
Yeah.
So this is recency bias because I'm rewatching it. Picard, which we haven't named here, season 1, episode 1, is really... I'm a crier, so I've been crying watching it again. I'm a crybaby. In the first episode of season 1, we find Picard, now an older man. He's gone through so many things, right? And he's sitting there, especially doing this game with Data. And Data has died. And what we find throughout this whole episode is after Data's death, Picard is conflicted in grieving the loss of a friend. And the murky part is this is
We're going to need a spoiler alert.
Sorry. But I think what is so beautiful, I often think about and write about grief and the ways that it impacts us. And I have a Substack called Musings from a Broken Heart because of this reality of how does grief shape us. And so we find that all of Picard's life now is revolving around this grief for a friend and thinking that he didn't do enough to save him. He didn't do enough to honor him. He didn't cherish the moments with him. And so all of his life is kind of spinning around, I didn't do right by Data. And so I'm just struck again with unresolved grief and not being able to tackle it. What does that do to our current relationships and the relationships that we've left behind?
Barry, any?
I won't talk about my favorite because people have mentioned the Borg episodes, the Inner Light. These are like classic ones. I'll just mention very quickly, Beverly Crusher's world is disappearing. That was a very impactful episode. But I will talk a little bit about an episode that I've been thinking about today for the context of this one. And this is the one where Worf is going through a spiritual crisis. And he decides to meditate. And the Jesus figure of the Klingons appears to him. This is Kahless, right? Yep. And it's exactly a Jesus figure. This is a person who was a prophet from 1,000 years ago that united, the Klingon homeworld around tenets that he had preached. And this person appears, and it's not a vision; it's a flesh and blood individual. And so, at first, there has to be this kind of coming to terms with the reappearance. Is this the reemergence of the Jesus figure to kind of bring the Klingons, unify them in a way that the second coming of Christ is supposed to be? And then they discover that it's actually cloned from genetic material that was left behind by Kahless. And all of the tenets come from the installation of memories that come from the sacred scriptures, right? And so all of the memories come from things that people have been reading and processing. And once this is known, it's still the case that, maybe half of the Klingons decide that, no, this is the second coming of Kahless. Nobody said that couldn't be the way that it happened. Whereas the other half are aligned with sort of the political leader of the Klingon world who says, this is a fraud, I am the real leader of the Klingon. And the thing that I find interesting about this episode is that it really is Star Trek coming to terms with, like, on the one hand, we have the material reality, which is like living beings, our DNA that are like enacted, and even Kahless was like an individual that lived at a certain time and is now cloned and reappeared, and so on, with the idea that, no, the figure of Kahless is still much more than just like an individual that happened to be a leader of the Klingon world 1,000 years ago, and now there's a different leader. And so they had to come to terms with that. And just like everything in The Next Generation, things were quite tidy in how they resolved the episode.
They just wrapped it up.
They just wrapped it up by saying, well, they'll share. One's going to be the emperor, like a monarch with no political power, and then the other will be the actual political leader, and everybody was happy with that, right? But I mean, if you think about it in the context of our world, they're trying to say something like, look, will the second coming of Jesus be like a clone? And then if that happened, will like people accept it? But maybe not. Maybe half the world will not accept that.
Well, I don't know. We have the Shroud of Turin, so.
Okay. Steve.
I'm sorry.
I was thinking about that. But there are so many Messiah figures throughout Star Trek.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, even Spock has like this Messiah moment when in the movies, right? When he dies and then he is shot out and he lands on the Genesis, on the planet with the, the Genesis transformation. And then he gets a rebirth. And then he has to come back and, retrieve his memories from Dr. McCoy. But something that, in a transhumanist point of view, in the first episodes of Deep Space Nine, we encountered the prophets or the wormhole aliens.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Right, who are entities that have evolved.
Yes,
And now by the Bajorans, they are considered these gods
and
almost.
Kind of outside of time.
Yes, because they don't experience linear time, right? They experience all time at once. Yeah. So that might be interesting from a transhumanist point of view, right? Like how something can evolve to be. for another culture.
Yeah, and I regret that I haven't yet consumed Deep Space Nine at all. Everyone's telling me I have to, so it's on my list.
This is the moment. This
Yes.
is it.
It's on my list, but I have some thoughts that at least tying in with this idea of the manifestation of a returning figure, right? I think that right now something on everyone's minds is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's often predicted by transhumanists and others is this idea that this kind of godlike power manifest in this entity, this computed system that can answer all your questions, can give you everything you seem to need to know, could almost essentially
Write your
become,
term paper.
Right. It could almost essentially
Which I
become
need.
a kind of messiah figure. And that's a threatening thought as well. I mean, I'm not trying to present this as like an easy fix for humanity, right? That's the great question. Is this going to destroy us or is it going to exalt us? And I think whether we're pets or prey of our AI masters, both of those present a failure scenario.
It's so funny that you mentioned that because I was thinking as you were talking, Star Trek Discovery again, but this idea of AI, in the first couple of seasons, there is this malevolent AI presence called Control trying to take over everything. And it's trying to wipe out sentient beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what people fear most in AI, right? Is it's going to wipe us all out. We have so many movies about that. But there's also this idea where the ship, the USS Discovery, actually becomes sentient. Mm-hmm. And it evolves and it grows. It eventually grows to the point where it has feelings and will, and it becomes this generative force, and it's named Zora. And so this actually helps the crew evolve too. Under the tutelage of all these people, Zora becomes this being that's able to help each of the crew members survive, right? So these two models of AI, one is generative and one's trying to kill everyone. So yeah.
Yeah, I actually think that some kind of symbiosis with our technology. I mean, it's happened ever since we invented controlled fire or clothing, right?
Yes.
Our technology has become a part of us. And I think some kind of symbiotic relationship is hopefully what we're going for there. Not either becoming them like the Terminator scenario or coddling us as pets or whatever, right?
And we have a precursor of that in the motion picture, right? When V'ger comes back and Spock mind melds with V'ger so he can understand, why is the machine trying to destroy. And there's this, that's actually probably one of my favorite moments in all of Star Trek, when Spock wakes up and he's holding Kirk's hand and talks about how V'ger cannot comprehend friendship, love, and all of those things, right? So that's such a tender and beautiful moment there.
So it's interesting that actually, as we've talked, different series have popped up.
Yeah.
Like we didn't even list at the beginning, like Picard being a new one. Why has it lasted through so many incarnations? Why am I excited when I hear that there will be another one?
So fantasy for me as a child was a survival tool. Mm-hmm. I grew up in chaos and dysfunction. And so I love your VHS stories are like in my mind right now and just what fantasy did for you. But for me, it allowed me to play in the realm of my imagination and what could we do when we are at our best. And so I think what Star Trek does for people, it allows people to transcend where we are now and go someplace else. And I think at its best, Star Trek offers that to people. You go to different quadrants, you go to different civilizations. So I think that that's why it keeps reiterating itself, for me at least.
I think a key ingredient also is its utopian or positive nature, right? And I think that people come back to shows like Star Trek because they give us some hope for the future and they give us a glimpse of our possibilities.
But it also wrestles with with a lot of the things of humanity that we often wrestle with. Like even the awful fifth movie, right? When
Is that the one with the whales?
No, that one's amazing. No, it's the
one that William Shatner
the Final
directed.
Frontier. Yeah, the one that William Shatner did. Right. So
I hope he doesn't
Spock's-
listen to this.
Spock's evil brother is trying to take his little commune outside of the galaxy,
I
right?
missed
For
that
a
one. I
place
skipped
with no suffering.
Okay.
Right. So Kirk talks about how suffering made him who he is, right? Like you can't just eliminate suffering and hope to have the same wisdom about life, because who you are was forged through all of the trials that you've been through and through all that hope that you've gained from all of that suffering. So he's clearly opposed to finding a place where there's no suffering.
Utopia is not the right word. I probably should have said something else, but the positive view of the future, right?
Yeah.
The view of human possibility there, right? Yeah, definitely.
To me, this all ties in with Dorothy wakes up after her time in Oz.
Like Captain Picard, right?
Yeah, and she's going, and you were there, and you were there. And so we're thinking, oh, it was all just a dream. But in The Wiz, the stage musical version.
I love that you... Famous Steve, this is why you're my favorite.
Oh, okay. So then Diana Ross. Dorothy, it probably helped that it was Diana Ross singing at the time for me. And she's saying, living here may be a fantasy. Da-da-da-da. But it taught me to love, so it's real, real to me. She did it so much better. Anyway.
That was beautiful.
So the whole thing, just the idea that art lets us play with the idea or have an experience and actually be changed from it without having to ourselves live the experience.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I've been thinking about the Tuvix episode in Voyager, which I still feel big feelings about. And for those who haven't watched it, it's this episode where there's a transporter accident and Neelix and Tuvok become merged in one being. And so there's this, I'm a theoethicist. And so there's this ethical implication of now this is a separate entity from both Tuvok and Neelix. He wants to live a life. And so now they are wrestling with, to your point of, do we separate this being and make these two individual people whole again? Or do we allow him to live and flourish on his own because he has desires that are separate from both of his predecessors? And I think the wrestle I had as a young person was he deserves the right to live. And though that will make a lot of people sad, to your earlier point is, what is the ethical murkiness here of, do we have to kill him to bring these other people back? And my answer is still, Janeway made the wrong choice. Because I was like, no, I like Tuvix. But that isn't fair, because does Tuvok have a right to come back? Does Neelix have a right to come back? Yeah, I don't know. But I think the beauty in that is the wrestle caused me to be a different person and to realize life isn't just black and white. There are degrees to these decisions that we make.
Yes, and this is what Star Trek has that other popular things don't. Like, I don't find this in like the Marvel universe, or maybe some in the X-Men series, but not as much in the other ones, is that murkiness, right? That constant wrestle, that, thinking like, was that really the right choice? Or, like the eternal question that maybe you could answer, why would anyone live outside of the holodeck?
Right. Yeah, why would anybody live outside?
Because I wouldn't.
There are so many episodes about the violation of the Prime Directive.
That was a topic I really wanted to touch on.
Because that non-intervention, but the intervention is just seems absolutely necessary for moral reasons that we have to intervene. These other examples of it. One thing that I think Star Trek also brings is there are certain kinds of moral red lines in it that in the space of science fiction, consumers of it recognize, and you can see that the better human is the person who doesn't torture, for instance. There was this torture episode with Picard having been tortured by a Cardassian to extract information. And that essentially happened maybe a decade before the actual torture debates were going on in this country.
Waterboarding.
Over waterboarding and so on. And in the real world context, probably more than half the country didn't have the discussion that was had in Star Trek. Rather, they were thinking about, well, our security and there are some situations, and that's fantasy, but this is real life. Whereas in Star Trek, it was pretty clear.
It's like in your search for safety, do you become your enemy?
Right.
The thing that you were saying, well, they're that way, and then suddenly...
But people recognize in watching of Star Trek that anybody who went down that path, even if they did get security, was not becoming their better selves.
Right.
Right.
Wow.
But right. And so one of the things that science fiction allows us to do is like take scenarios that we very well might be in an environment where we can recognize that our better selves would want the outcome to be this way and not another way.
But
right?
it gives us a little distance to look
Yeah.
at it. Yeah,
That's right.
because it's not.
It's not our direct. It's
Our
like
direct
it's not a
experience,
direct
yeah.
translation,
Yeah,
but you
that's a
can
great
see it
point.
from a different light.
Right.
And you're not turning cultures or people into teaching tools, right? Like you're allowing to preserve their humanity, but you can explore it still in a way that you can wrestle with the big questions.
I remember when I was in high school, there was a teacher. This was in the 90s, so this is before a lot of like open LGBTQ stuff. And this was a teacher where there was a club for Gay Straight Alliance, but that was secret at the time. And I think he was very circumspect on who to inform about this. He informed me about this. I didn't end up joining. I don't remember what it was, but he was a Star Trek fan. And his favorite episode was the one where there was an alien culture where there were no genders.
I literally was thinking about this
Yes.
in Riker.
The pods.
Yeah, they're just no genders, but they were rigidly no gender. So those who felt the pulls of a gender identity were forced to undergo psychiatric treatment and whatever it was, electrical, whatever. And one falls in love with Riker,
yeah.
and identified as being female as a result, and gives a speech hoping that they will not subject her to these kinds of treatments that'll erase her gender identity. So the inversion of the problem that we face, right, and the recognition that our better selves would seek to liberate this individual rather than, but the ending to that episode was that she was essentially forced to undergo these treatments and came out on the other end completely puzzled that she was this individual before and felt that she was sick and so on. And that was the episode that he just kept citing and talking about.
One thing about, if I could jump to the prime directive question, just because I think it's so important, I think it really touches on that age-old question of the problem of evil, really. It's like, why do bad things happen to good people? And I think that the prime directive gives us like a strong answer from the Star Trek universe, and that they feel that it would result in all sorts of worse outcomes if they interfered in the affairs of these planets that are still progressing to the state where the current Federation is.
Almost like they have the right to make their own mistakes.
That's right.
In Star Wars, sorry I'm sorry. So in this new show, The Acolyte, one of the figures says, this is about power and who gets the right to use it. And so the thing about the prime directive that's interesting is they have all these codes, but only certain figures, if you actually go through all of the shows, only certain people have the power to break it. So it seems like a great idea. We don't want to interfere in the evolution of a different culture, but certain people, especially men, get the opportunities under certain circumstances that they deem necessary to help others. But you have to think of, they also watched other cultures die. They watched other worlds die.
And there are trade-offs too. Like sometimes they make mistakes, right?
Yeah, there are trade-offs. The problem is when you become God, who gets the right to say when I should save your planet and cause yours to die, right? And so I think the murkiness of it, they don't always help everyone. Right? It's who they deem worthy of salvation. And that's a whole different podcast, right? Especially religiously, that's a whole different.
If we can do that, then we need one on Dune.
Yes.
Salvation is an interesting theme.
Yes.
That we can talk about in Star Trek.
So aside from the very pressing why live anywhere but the holodeck question, is also sometimes they go searching for something, they're out of dilithium crystals, and I think you have a replicator. Order a dilithium crystal for lunch. And
For
then
that
you've got
matter,
one, but-
why are they all aging and dying? Like, that's something I always ask as a transhumanist, right? It's like they've got all this advanced technology. They got tricorders that can just heal any problem. Well, aging is a degenerative problem, right? Why are they, but of course that would create so many problems with casting and everything. It would just mess us all up. We're just not ready.
They do live much longer. Like Dr. McCoy was very, very old at the beginning of Next Generation.
Yeah, that's true. There's a working hypothesis about storytelling. Like, you need a scarcity of something.
Yeah.
If you don't have material scarcity, you need temporal scarcity or a knowledge scarcity. Otherwise, the complete non-scarcity of something creates no forward momentum in any kind of story, any kind of life, any kind of existence.
But the question also is immortality desirable?
Right.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we might not all agree on that, right?
It's a fair question.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because the Vulcans are living a long time. They're not immortal, but they're living. There's interesting things within the lifespan of a Vulcan.
Okay, now we can bring in Lord of the Rings and the elves.
The elves, yeah. I mean, definitely.
And the elves are
and their life
terrible
are
people.
still finite, but they've eliminated disease.
Yeah, and I
Right?
would say
So-
that even for someone who is immortal, change is inevitable. Change is a kind of death, right? In the sense that you can never go back to when your daughter was 3 years old and you were playing with her on your lap. Like that is still a scarcity of sorts that I think we will still face even if we someday achieve some kind of immortality.
And I've always wondered if they used the holodeck and said, I want to go back and I want to play with my 3-year-old daughter, would you say this wasn't really it?
Right.
Like I
right.
tried to relive
Yeah.
it, but I couldn't really.
You weren't the
relive it.
same being who lived
You
in the
weren't.
first.
Yeah.
There's a numbness that can happen. Lord of the Rings, the elves become numb to world events because they are living so long. Because for them, 1,000 years is a blink of an eye. So for them, being involved in helping others becomes we can or we can choose not to because this civilization will die anyway, right? So it would be complicated. Also on the holodeck, we have Lieutenant Barkley who does want to live there, right? He's like, no, this is way better than the outside world.
Well, the holodeck also raises the age-old simulation argument, right? The idea of like, how do we really know that what we're experiencing right now is not being observed from some other frame of reference that's totally different, right?
Professor Moriarty episodes.
Yeah, get us out of here. If this is an illusion, come on, shut this thing down.
Okay, and then Barclay is given the knowledge to build a machine that jettisons them to the center of the universe so they could hear from what seems like either God or Santa Claus, or I couldn't tell exactly who it was.
Oh, I remember this
or
one.
both, depending on what you view of God.
And then they go back and I think, well, he built the machine once. Can we say, do that again? Anyway, so all these conundrums.
Well, I was just thinking about the idea a bit of Star Trek and also Lord of the Rings. I mean, Tolkien said specifically that he was trying to create a mythic history, a mythic prehistory of England because it didn't really have one. And it feels like Star Trek in a way is like the mythic, maybe post-history for non-religious Western people, right, who don't really have a mythic tradition of their own. And we're interested in it because we see the parallels to our religious ideas. But I don't know, part of this conversation has made me think about whether our religious traditions are working right today. Because, like, are we able to talk about, like, Jesus and Moses and in ways to make the kinds of connections to the big issues of our day the way we just did over the last hour about Star Trek? I don't hear those conversations that often. I feel like a lot of times in our religious traditions, these stories are thought of more as history than myth, in the sense that, yeah, I mean, this happened to Jesus. It happened to Moses. It's not really relevant to my life because it's just something that happened to someone else. And whereas a myth says this is happening all the time. And so, of course, it's relevant. And I think that those stories are powerful myths, but we've sort of lost some of the capacity to access them that way because orthodoxies of various kinds have said that that's not the right way to access those stories.
I kind of want that to be the last word because you really kind of tied things in ways that can be good for us, but ways that we might have been missing. So, Dan, thank you very much. All of you, thank you. This has been
so much fun.
It was fun.
A very, very fun thing. So, thank you all. This is In Good Faith. We're beaming out now. This episode was produced by Heather Bigley. Our production team also includes Aaliyah Ebert, Katarina Martinic, Soraya Pearson, and James Sturdivant. Our post-production team includes DJ Cromarty, Gracie Davis, and Mark Hansen. Spread the word about In Good Faith by leaving a comment and subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. In Good Faith is committed to the idea that we all benefit from hearing people of widely varying backgrounds share their personal experience with faith and belief. We think people with such experience deserve some of our best listening. Find us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. Our YouTube page is youtube.com/in-good-faith. In Good Faith is a production of BYU Radio. I'm Stephen Cap Perry. I hope you join us again soon, right here in Good Faith.